Hey, hi. I'm Dan. I work at Capybara Games. I used to work at Ubisoft. I've worked at other places too. Yeah, there you go. That's all you need to know. Basically, one thing I kind of want to ask first is how many people here are artists? Okay, easy question then. How many people are not artists? There, ooh, you're in between. You kind of are, but you kind of aren't. You're whatever you want to be when it comes to art. What a cliche thing to say. Anyways, how many people here have used ZBrush at all? Otherwise, everybody's completely new to this. ZBrush is probably my favorite piece of modeling software. I absolutely love using it. It's super versatile, super easy to do a whole bunch of really quality stuff in. It's also the worst thing to learn ever. It's probably an exaggeration, but it's also kind of not. Straight up, how many people here have worked in 3D before, like other 3D modeling packages and things like that? Cool, yeah, ZBrush ain't that. It is its own weird, bizarre thing. It's super powerful, super fun, but if you come in with a lot of preconceptions of how you think modeling should happen and how it shouldn't happen, you're gonna have a bad time and you're gonna get frustrated. So don't, but you will and you're gonna get frustrated. ZBrush is like a super confusing piece of software because it does and asks for weird things from you. Just kind of like try to cruise through it a little bit, and we're gonna cover how to do some basic stuff, how to kind of get going into that process and how you can start to enjoy working in it. There's a lot of stuff we're not gonna cover because it's a deep well of a program, but also each new thing you learn is also unnecessarily complicated to learn. So we'll deal with all the interesting parts first so that you can have fun with it. Refer to my notes here. Yeah, the closest example that you've got to what this is going to be like is like actual traditional sculpting. Ooh. Oh, it's because my computer shut down because I talked too long. Sorry. There we go. Okay, woo! Start partying. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to do, who doesn't have ZBrush opened yet? Cool, that's fine. I'm going to consistently refer to it as ZBrush. I've often called it ZBrush before, and then been told nope, because it's a piece of software. It's been named by an American company, so technically ZBrush is the term that they use for it, even though it may be functionally incorrect. But just because I've called it ZBrush enough times and had people be like, what? So the first thing that we want to get into is the interface. If this is the basic setup you're seeing, awesome. If you're not, you may see something like, just there we go, and this. So you may see something like this, nothing showing up. In fact, you may, if you start trying to do anything on that canvas, you may get something like this. This, you might realize, is not what you want. That's not modeling. Basically, the first thing you got to understand is that ZBrush initially is going to start off as a 2.5D modeling package, which is totally not what you or probably anybody wants. Basically, it's got three-dimensional stuff, but it's totally flat. It's an actual document. It's one reason why you'll see up here that there is a document button. Can you guys see this? Is that it's all good, clear? There's a document button because there is literally a document here. Anything in this tab is actually going to be dealing with like the document stuff. Guess what? I like never use this. The fact of the matter is you don't want to deal with this part. If you ever start drawing anything on that canvas and you want to get rid of it, treat it like a new document, and Control-N will get rid of anything that's on that canvas. Control-N is perfectly good for you because it will always get rid of the stuff that's floating around there, and you never want that stuff. Pretty much ever, unless you're getting into advanced techniques, which we're not doing today. You're never going to need to. Control-N will always get rid of a bunch of junk that's on that canvas. So the first thing you want to do is go over here to our cylinder 3D object, because we can actually get sculpting really quick. So you can click this piece and you can drag it onto your canvas anywhere, and basically you'll be able to control the orientation of this object. Now, of course, if you do this again, okay. If I want to, okay, let's rotate this object. Nope, that's not Why would I want to do any of this? This is, again, the 2.5D canvas. Literally, you're just dropping a cylinder onto this canvas. Again, not what you want. So what you want to do is drag out one of them. Perfectly good. And then you can go up here to this little area called Edit. This little button. Who cannot see this button? Because UI is different in some situations. You all see that little Edit button right here? Boom. When you click that, we go into the 3D editing mode. I also want to be super, super clear. If at any point you get lost or you get confused, you just check with me. Just check. Just say, hey, what? Hey, what? So do you see the edit button?
Yeah, but what about the cases that you managed to like put them at angles and stuff?
Don't even worry about that.
Okay.
Don't even at all worry about what was happening there, because you don't want to do that. It was like a bad thing I was doing. It's basically just if you keep putting it on the canvas, it's just going to keep going there. You don't want it. You just want edit. So edit is what's going to give us the ability to start sculpting. Now, how do we do anything? Well, first we got to deal with navigation. So first you got this little cylinder here. If you click and drag outside of the object that you've got, you will rotate around it. Depending on where you position your mouse, you'll end up with kind of a different rotation feel, depending on where you go. For the most part, basically you're dealing with a rotation that's on all axes at once. If you wanted to constrain that a little bit more, it's what I did for a long time early on, was I constrained it to potentially the y-axis or the x, y, and z-axis, which is right here. These little pieces here control how you deal with axes. So it's just these little buttons here, and so you can start to kind of rotate the object. Generally speaking, I actually do use the x, y, z rotation at all times. It feels a little finicky, but you get used to it. Oh, actually, also, last question. Who here does not have a like Wacom tablet or like a pen pressure tablet for doing this? Who doesn't? You're gonna have a hard time. ZBrush is not that much fun with a mouse, straight up. If you want to do consistent kind of ZBrush work, you absolutely want a tablet. You can get pretty cheap ones for like 60 bucks. Wacom is not the necessary one that you need to go with. They last for a very long time. They don't wear out very much, but you don't necessarily need to go in that direction. A lot of the other ones work just as well. And especially some of the lower line into like a bamboo tablets, they all work actually really great. And they're only 90 bucks, which is more manageable than their like $600 version ones. You don't need to go pro right away on any of them from the get-go. So we got this, we can rotate it around. Now, how do we pan and move the object around on the canvas? Well, you hold Alt and you drag around on the empty space. Basically, most kind of movement stuff happens in this empty space. So anytime you want to do that stuff, that's how you're going to be dealing with it. Now, how do you zoom? Zoom is the most insane kind of way of doing this. What you have to do, please listen close. You have to hold Alt to pan this around. We did this before. But now what you're going to do is continue holding your mouse down, let go of Alt.
What? No.
It becomes like muscle memory, and you'll be just fine. But your brain will invert on itself for a little while. You get used to it. Just kind of like basically you kind of pan around, and then you just let go, and you just kind of zoom in. It becomes like a weird second nature, like if you've like briefly been hit by like a Cthulhu kind of logic, but you'll get used to it. So that is basically how we navigate around. We can rotate and we can do that stuff. So let's get sculpting. So like try to draw on that thing. Whoa, we get this error. Hey.
Can I ask one thing about the zoom?
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a way to like edit that so that's not the way to zoom?
There is one other way of zooming. I looked for it. I cannot find it. I heard it once, and oh yeah, I'm going to come back to it. I've heard of the other way of zooming, and I have zero idea of how to do it. Oh, there is. Yeah. There's this one, but we're zooming in on the canvas.
There's a scale lower down.
Yes. There's this one too. You could use this. I hate this even more because I actually have to take my, like, if I'm panning and doing all this stuff over here, I got to go over here to zoom. Which breaks my brain, and I don't like it. The fact, again, with ZBrush, there's lots of ways that you could potentially change the way that it works. I do oddly recommend, and I usually don't, just diving in and just getting used to it. Because even though it is really, really weird at first, your muscle memory takes over after a pretty short period of time, and the more you struggle, the more you kind of sink into that quicksand and die. This is a bad example. So let's just zoom back in. So just so we're clear here, I was moving this stuff too. These are like document moving things. You'll never use these. Don't bother with them. But there they are. So if we want to start actually sculpting this thing, if we click on it, you'll see it says to enable sculpting, please convert to 3D primitive. Why does it not do this in the first place? Kind of nonsense. Again, this is the kind of garbage that you'll have to deal with when you first jump into ZBrush and you go, why is everything strange and confusing and doesn't work the way it should? All you need to do is go over here to this Make Polymesh 3D. It's a little button right here. Bing. You just click that. And then now, my object has been turned into a Polymesh 3D, and I can start sculpting. And I can just start drawing on that object. And I recommend that you do that. Just like start pushing stuff around. Basically what's happening is ZBrush and its brushes are all just moving vertices very, very quickly. You're not at all sculpting, you're just moving verts, and it's just pushing them. And that's basically it. If you hold Alt, then you'll push stuff in when you sculpt. If you hold Shift, then you smooth things instead of sculpting. So I can push out by just clicking and dragging, and I hold Shift to smooth things out. And this doesn't look very good because it's, there's not enough information going on. If I go down here into this geometry section, I can start doing things like divide. Divide is one of the main things that you're going to be dealing with to add in geometry to your model. So it's just down here, you click open these little various pieces. That's the main interface for ZBrush, is that you open up these little various tabs. There's one for subtool, there's one for geometry, there's one for all of these various pieces here, and you get to scroll down through all of it. You will discover soon enough, this is an annoying interface too. There's a theme, don't worry, there is a theme of it. It's super annoying. I love ZBrush. It is bonkers to learn at first. But every time I point out these uncomfortable, frustrating things, a number of them can be made actually much, much easier to access. It's a very, very customizable interface. You just got to get used to it at first. So what we can do is press that little divide button or Control D. So if we press divide, what's going to happen is it's going to subdivide our model. For those that are familiar with 3D, it's basically just adding 4 polygons for every polygon that you have. It's just subdividing the polygons. So in this case, because we have more polygons to work with, we have more detail. If I divide again, more detail. Yay. What a great day. So I'm just using the clay buildup brush at the moment. Normally, you'd probably be using the standard brush, which will end up giving you a result similar to this. So that's pretty good, but we're not really dealing with anything that kind of actually makes sense. So let's start over, because that whole first part, confusing. Let's repeat it. Yeah.
I lost my menu.
You lost your menu?
Right-hand side.
Oh, probably this button. There's a little button here, the little divider, which will close that out so you can see more of your canvas if in case you didn't need that menu there. Press tab. If you press tab, sometimes that brings stuff back. Good, good. All right, so this is a perfectly fine setup. You can continue sculpting this way, but this is not the way that I like to work. It's perfectly fine, but let's kind of get into doing sort of a character. So what I want to do is actually start off with something better. So let's go in a little bit more detail. There's this tool button here. So up here in the tools section, we're dealing with tools. Tools are always referring to basically your models. Your models in ZBrush are referred to as tools. So when you save certain things, it's referred to as a tool. Why? It's a good question. Questions, yeah, I don't know. It's bizarre. Why do they call it a tool? Why don't they call it a model? Crazy. Either way, I'm going to press Tool, open this up, and basically I gain access to any of the kinds of sculpting options that I want here. Generally speaking, again, you're only going to be dealing with 3D meshes, which shows up right here. Sphere 3D, especially if we're doing any kind of character work or organic sculpting, this is what we're going to be dealing with. So I'm going to just click the Sphere 3D, and it's going to automatically swap my model to the sphere. Question is, where did that super sweet cylinder go? Well, it's just over here. This is my tool dock. This is going to contain all the various meshes that I've been using as separate tools. You can have multiple tools in a ZBrush project, which you get by pressing Control S. Control S is our save option. It'll save a project. And this is what we get. Now, a project contains multiple tools. Hooray. That's the general kind of result that you'd want. So I'm just going to save this to the desktop. DMG work, save. And that's going to save that whole thing out. It's going to basically keep my cylinder and this current sphere. But again, I want to make this into something I can sculpt, so I need to press Make Polymesh 3D. So anytime you pick one of these basic objects, you just need to press Make Polymesh 3D, and it'll turn it into a Polymesh 3D object, which you can sculpt. Why is there a distinction? Good question. I don't know. Yeah.
How did you get the sphere again?
The sphere, you just click this little tool button here, this larger tool, and you'll get a whole bunch of options in here, and the sphere is just inside of that.
Okay.
So now that it's sculptable, we want to start maybe sculpting a face. So for example, I could start trying to sculpt some eyes, maybe just kind of like this. Maybe I want a really great smile. Perfect. I'm really good. I do a good job. So we've got this. That's pretty great, but what if we want to be a lot faster with this? Well, Control Z works the way you'd expect, but if I press X and pan around my model, there we go, you'll find where the X-axis is. X is going to automatically turn on symmetry on my sculpting, which means when I start to sculpt, it's going to appear on both sides. It's very, very fast and very manageable to do. So I can start kind of sculpting out some eyebrows and getting maybe the kind of shape that I want, maybe a cool eye, and just part of a mouth, like this. Hooray. Again, what a great sculptor I is. But again, let's get a little bit deeper. The fact of the matter is there's not a lot of detail here, and I might want to start doing a little bit more work with this. So let's change this shape so that it's going to work a little bit better. But we got to do a few things to get that result. First off, we need to get control over what our brush is doing, which is up here. It's also, if you press spacebar and hold it, you'll see draw size, focal shift, and Z intensity. This spacebar area here gives you a lot of functions right away. It's super, super useful. I can change my brush, I could change my tool, I could change my kind of strokes or my materials, lots of stuff right away. It's also all available up here at the top. Now, Z intensity is going to change how intense my brush stroke is. So you'll see, as I sculpt, this is pushing up a lot. If my Z intensity goes down, that's basically how much things are going to push out on that Z axis. So now if I start to sculpt, it's barely doing anything on these areas here because my Z intensity is so low. But now it's a little bit more controllable. By going with a low intensity sometimes, you can get better results. Especially if you're using a mouse, it'll just mean you need to like click and stroke a lot to be able to get the results that you want gradually. If you're using a mouse and you're trying to sculpt and you have too much intensity, then you're kind of like always doing a full intense stroke, which just doesn't look nice. So you got to build. Yep.
How do you change the axis of symmetry?
You change it in a few steps that I will cover soon. Stick with the X one for now. Yeah.
Is there a way to reset the view if it's got it rotated funky?
If you go with, where is it here? Hold, drag around and hold shift. And it'll kind of lock to the various axes that are sort of cardinal. Yeah. You hold shift outside while you're rotating. Just hold shift and it'll snap.
Excuse me?
Yep.
I have a gray sphere, not an orange sphere. What have I done wrong?
You have actually done nothing wrong. You just have a different material by default.
I just can't see anything new in it. It's just flat.
Oh, it's totally flat? Then what you'll want...
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Got here late.
That's okay. What you want is... So with this one, it's your material, I think.
Oh my god, you're making a calculator.
Um,
It's three objects.
I... Sorry. This will be recorded anyways, though, just so everybody knows as well. This will be recorded in case you want to come back to it. So I'm probably going to make less pauses like that for the purposes of a video later. I hadn't thought about that in advance, but that's totally okay. So for this, though, we got this guy, so I can start changing the Z intensity here. I could also start changing the draw size, which will give me more ability to sculpt out some of these structures. But again, my Z intensity is too high, so I want to gradually build some of those surfaces a little bit slower so that I can start to create the kind of shape that I would want. I can hold Alt to kind of push certain areas down if I wanted to make kind of a chin shape. And I could hold Shift to kind of smooth out some of these sections so I can start to make a generalized head shape. Just kind of moving around that surface to build out these various pieces. But again, this is kind of clunky and slow. I might want to do a bit more. So for example, I got different kinds of sculpting tools that I can use. If you click this little brush area, then you can actually deal with brushes. If I scroll on down here, I've got a lot of options. Now my screen's pretty small, so it's hard for me to see these. But basically, you can see right here, I've got Move. Move is a very common brush that I use very, very frequently. Move is basically going to allow me to just move certain sections of my model. So for example, if I wanted to make horns, I could start to kind of just pull out these various pieces. Now where you pull is going to change how this is going to feel. So for example, if I pull towards the end of this, I'm going to start finding, for one, that I don't actually have enough geometry. Things are getting kind of gross. So what do we do now? Well, generally speaking, when you're dealing with most modeling packages, this is where you run into trouble. When you want to try to pull stuff out, then you've got to start adding in edge loops and things like that to pull out and extrude more things. This is why I love ZBrush. ZBrush is great at mesh generation, which means it's going to make its own mesh, which is great. So first off, I'm just going to press Shift F. Shift F is the quick shortcut key for polyframe. It's actually a little button that's like at the bottom of my screen. You might be able to see it on yours if your screen is better, but that's where it is. There's other axes to get to that, but for now, Shift F is where you get quick access to seeing what your polyframe looks like. And you can see here that we actually just don't have many polygons. I've kind of been pulling these vertices around, and I just don't have much to work with. How do we fix it? Well, let's scroll on down back into geometry here, and we can check out Dynamesh. Now inside Dynamesh, did you just click it already, or?
No.
Oh, okay.
I have never used ZBrush before.
Yeah.
There's lots of things about that.
Dynamesh is the business. Basically, hey, let's just click Dynamesh. Just click the button that says Dynamesh. It'll take a moment, and now you can look at your polyframe, and suddenly you've got all sorts of polygons. You've got polygons for days, which is great. Just right here. Now, Dynamesh basically means I can start moving this geometry back around with my move tool. I could start pulling stuff around and be a real happy boy. Start moving that chin around. Start trying to make some basic geometry for this face. Do you see it, Dynamesh? I'm hearing like, Dynamesh. Does anybody not see Dynamesh yet? It's under geometry. Yeah, there's a little thing you open up. There you go. And you got Dynamesh. And you click Dynamesh. You just click the button and you're good to go. And then you can kind of start pulling things out and maneuvering things around. What Dynamesh is doing, it's a very good question. It almost leads directly into what I was about to say, which is perfect. It makes me sound like I'm answering really nicely. Basically, what Dynamesh does is it looks over your model, it looks over the surface of the model, and adds polygons in to take on that shape. And if you've turned it on, it also projects that new shape onto the old one. It's very good at maintaining form. But the question is, for example, there's this much detail. Like there's all these polygons in here. How do they get made? Well, that's based on the resolution. Now, here's the thing. Resolution is not consistent in a way that you'd understand as a human person. Because resolution is based on the size of your model. What's the size of your model, you ask? Good question. Good luck figuring it out. There's a couple ways to find that out, but it's hard to find. So by default, you have no idea what the size of your model is. So you don't know what size you should pick for resolution. So the size you should pick for resolution every single time is, wow, it doesn't matter, because you're going to have to try it again anyways. Basically, my solution to resolution is I pick a low number, let's say the lowest, and I re-Dynamesh. So I can turn this off, turn it back on, and I get this now. So the lowest resolution gives me this. A higher resolution would give me more detail. So I turn that off, turn it back on, and I see nothing happened. How come? Every time that you want to Dynamesh, you need to just adjust your model slightly. So if I just go like this, and I turn Dynamesh off and turn it back on, it's going to re-Dynamesh. Problem is, my resolution is much higher now, so it's projecting out all those details. So I have to wait a while. Basically, now there's a lot more geometry, and it's taking on the shape of that like very polygonal piece, but actually has a ton of detail in it. So like I can sculpt in some like really detailed things, but it looks like it's low polygon because it's projected out those flat, faceted surfaces. Here's the thing. Resolution basically creates polygons that exist at a certain size in space. So, whatever the resolution is, if you increase the size of your object at any point, these polygons will stay the same size, so you will functionally have more polygons on your model because your model is taking up more space. Does that make a vague, weird sort of sense? If it doesn't, just fiddle with resolution until it is the kind of detail level that you want. Or shrink your model. So, I'm going to drop this resolution because generally speaking, and what is unintuitive at first, is that Dynamesh is better and most sculpting is better for big forms with less polygons. The fewer polygons you're dealing with, the easier it is to deal with big, broad forms and create shape and design. When you're dealing with stuff like this, things get harder to move because the move tool is also dependent, and pretty much everything is dependent on how many polygons you have. So for example, when I smooth here, I'm kind of only smoothing like very, very surface kind of details. If I reduce this and re-Dynamesh, and I smooth now, I'm smoothing big, big, big forms. Everything you do is basically dealing with the certain amount of detail level that you have. So the main thing is when you're dealing with big shapes, big forms, stay lower polygon, and then just keep kind of Dynameshing and going higher and higher resolution as you go into a deeper and deeper kind of detail level. So I've got a basic structure here, but Dynamesh seems pretty annoying to have to turn it back on and off. Well, there's a much faster way of doing it. You can just sculpt, 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 and hold Control and drag an empty space here like this. Yeah, I know. Oh, you're raising your hands because it seems like it doesn't make any sense to do that. Well, that's reasonable, but do it. And there you go, it re-Dynameshed. ZBrush does not follow conventions of like what would be the way you'd think of doing something, but you get used to it. It also happens to be a very easy workflow because once you kind of get into the practice of it, you can sculpt, 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 like maybe increase that resolution a little bit, just create an empty little spot here, and you get more detail. So you never have to keep this open anymore. Dynamesh is turned on perpetually, so when you drag into this empty space, it'll create all that new stuff again. Now, if your computer is running a little bit slow with the amount of resolution that you have, turn off project. Reproject Dynamesh is going to do an operation that for certain resolutions doesn't really need to happen, and for certain sculpting practices doesn't need to happen. But it takes a while to do it. So when you turn it off, the Dynamesh process goes a lot faster. Much, much, much quicker. Also, if you click in here, or with any of the sliders in ZBrush, you gain access to, when it lights up red, you can start typing stuff in. So I can type in like 100, or I can type in 80, and then just re-Dynamesh, and I'll get that new resolution. So I usually press Shift F a lot just to kind of check what that resolution is to start dealing with things. So now I'm going to make, I've already modeled this guy before, but I'm just going to kind of like do it in here because it's easy to start with, is starting to try to block in this like demon monster that was based off of a concept. So I can start kind of just moving around some of these big basic forms with that move brush. Now, if I want to start dealing with more detail, I can jump into what I prefer to use for sculpting, especially for characters, which is the clay buildup brush. Clay buildup's really nice because by default, what it's going to do is start to move the shape around in a more sculptural way, which means it's going to destroy the underlying surface, basically. So if I just lightly go across these surfaces here, and especially build along the forms, I can start to build in the kind of shape that I want. It'll also be really good at cutting things out. Especially if you're using a mouse, you're really going to want to make sure that you press a lot when it comes to the clay buildup brush. It requires a lot of movement with your brush back and forth. That's kind of how it works. So you kind of gradually build surfaces. I tend to use a relatively low Z intensity. And just so you know too, there are shortcut keys for Z intensity, draw size, and focal shift. In fact, I think my defaults are I can't. So I've got them set up right now to D, F, and S. D, S, D, and F. Those are set up for me for making these more editable so that I can quickly gain access to them and they're all right close to each other because I use these all very frequently. But how do you set up a hotkey? Because quite frankly, some of the hotkeys in ZBrush are non-existent and not very usable. How do we quickly make that better? Well, this is one of the great parts about ZBrush. You want to get a shortcut key for anything? Well, just Control-Alt, click the button that you want. Any one of these buttons, Control-Alt, click, and you'll see at the top here, right above my mouse, if I don't move too much, press any key combination to assign a custom hotkey. Cool. I'm just going to press S. Boom. Hotkey note, custom hotkey assigned. Whoop. Right up there at the top. Sweet. You can do this with anything, like actually anything. Any button that you see that you want a shortcut key for, let's say Dynamesh, you wanted to turn that off and on with a button, just Control-Alt-Click. It'll ask you to put in a button combination of some sort, so I could press L. Cool, nothing was set to that. So now, if I press L, it turns it off. If I press L again, it's going to re-Dynamesh. Yeah.
Can you use modifier keys like Alt and Shift?
You definitely can, which is very handy. Now, to find the document that shows you all this information, you do need to go like deeper and deeper to like actually find where the text file is that shows this stuff. Again, it's not always the smoothest process, but it's very easy to kind of set this stuff up. In fact, for any of these brushes, I actually have them all set up to my number keys. So, for example, you want to see all your brushes a little bit more accessibly? Well, Alt-click. If I Alt-click, this brush menu will show up here. Hey, don't close, thanks. So now I have my tool dock and my brush dock here. What are these? Well, they're actually what shows up right at the top here. So for example, here you can see I've got brush, and that shows me all my brushes. It's sort of the dock that contains the brush settings. It contains this UI element that is actually over here as well. UI elements inside of ZBrush repeat themselves in multiple situations, but they are all literally the same button. So in this case, for example, if I go down here to standard and I say Control-Alt-Click, it's going to ask me to put in a key combination of some sort. I'm just going to press 1. So now when I press 1, I get the standard brush. When I press 2, because I've set these up before, I get the clay buildup brush. 3 is the clay brush, which works pretty similar to the clay buildup, but is a little bit softer. 4 is nothing at the moment because it's a different normal key. 5 is the DAM standard brush, which we'll come to shortly. The DAM brush, also meaning Damien standard brush. Why is it named that? I have H set up as H polish, G is trim dynamic, and K is another one that's not set up in here, which is fine. So those give me a variety of things that I can start working with. Yeah, question.
Sorry,
No, it's okay.
This like project overlay that won't go away.
Press the comma key.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. You can also close that by pressing this lightbox button.
Oh, okay.
The lightbox gives you access to most of the features that are in like folders and stuff like that. Why you'd want to have access to it this way, I don't know, but you could. Most of these are also like brushes, for example, that are existing by default inside of the ZBrush folders, but they're not loaded by default with ZBrush. So things, for example, cool ones like a smooth brush that only smooths the let's see here. Smooth valleys should be in here. Smooth valley. So if I click this, for example, it'll say this brush that is selected is going to be for a smoothing brush. You have to press the Shift key and click to use it. This is just giving you a warning that if you start trying to click this brush, you're not going to see the result right away unless you're holding Shift. So it's swapping out my Shift brush. So if I just say OK at this moment, what you'll see is, I'm just going to try to create something that pops up a lot. Perfect, what a fun guy. Like this. Now what's going to happen here is if I hold Shift, you can see that my smooth brush is now actually called Smooth Valleys. So when I smooth here, basically nothing happens. I only smooth on the creases in my model, which is a really weird thing to have, but I have it. Let's just crank that up so that I get a bunch of straight lines here. And if I smooth now, whoops, if I smooth, I only smooth the valleys, because you can have lots of different types of brushes that you work with inside of ZBrush. Now, how do you get back your regular shift brush, or regular smooth? Hold Shift, click here again, and you can switch to whatever brush you want. So for example, while holding Shift, I could scroll on down here back to smooth, but it's real small on my screen. There we go, smooth, or smooth peaks, which will actually do the opposite of smooth valleys. So now with that turned on, I can just kind of smooth everything out. So what other brushes do we have here that are useful? Well, again, clay buildup, I think for character modeling is one of the best ones. Oh, I've got to change these buttons here. I've messed them up. Z intensity is E, or draw size is S. You know what? I need to restore. There we go. So anytime you make keyboard shortcut changes, pop up into Preferences and say Store. It'll be under Hotkeys, and you have to press Store. If you do not press Store, it did not store. If ZBrush crashes, and it will, it's going to be gone. Any of those shortcut key changes that you did, they are gone forever. You have to press Store. Store will put it into the startup settings of your ZBrush and will load up every time. If you use Save, it'll go into its own file, which you can then load, but still always press Store. So in this case, for example, I can kind of change some of my settings here. Whoops, smooth some stuff out, and start to kind of sculpt to the basic shape that I want. I don't want a lot of Z intensity when I'm using clay buildup. I just want to gradually build a certain kind of form. And in here too, I just want to reduce the intensity of that Dynamesh. I'm going to just click so that I can change the number. I'm going to change it to something like 40. Click and drag with Control into an empty space, and then re-Dynamesh. No, it went too high. I needed it to be 40. There we go. Just touch the mesh in some way and open it back up, and there we go. So now I can smooth out these big forms a lot easier. And I can use the Move brush again to start trying to push this back into its basic form. So I want a guy that's kind of got a big open mouth that's going to kind of push stuff in. I'm going to switch back to clay buildup with pressing 2. So that's going to speed up my workflow a lot. And just kind of sculpt in some of these big basic forms. I can hold Alt to push certain surfaces back down and start flattening certain sections out. Again, it's why I like to make sure that I'm working with a low division amount, because it's going to give me a bit more basic shape that I need to work with. Now, I want to cut in some eyes so that this doesn't look so weird right now. So what I'm going to use is the Damien Standard brush, which is in here under... Now, if you're looking through this menu and thinking, where do I find what I'm looking for? Well, press D for Damien Standard, and it's going to hide everything else. Now, you'll see there's little icons here for letters that you can press, S and these other ones. So if you press S, for example, because that's where Damien Standard is, it automatically goes to the Damien Standard brush. So a quick way of popping through some of those options in there. Now, Damien Standard is sort of a cut brush. It creates nice cuts. So for example, if I want to kind of cut an eye in here, an eye shape, I can do that and start to sculpt in that basic eye shape. I can smooth it out, cut in a little bit more, but I generally want to take that Z intensity way down and start to build in some simpler forms. Cut in a nose, bring that out a little bit more. But I've got a pretty ugly model at the moment, but it's got the basic shapes that I need, and I've got the basic tools to deal with. Generally speaking, the standard brush, the clay buildup, and the Damien standard brush are what I use most of the time. Like about 90% of the time, those brushes are my tool of choice, as well as the move brush, which I have personally set up to Control W, mainly because it makes me think of move in Maya or Max, so I just add control to it to pop me into that. So it means when I want to sculpt, I can start to just kind of push things around. If I want to start moving, I can press 1, start building up, whoa, way too much, drag down that Z intensity, start building this up to start getting some shapes that I want. Switch to Control W so that I can, without having to move my cursor away from my model, start getting the kind of shape that I actually want here. Now, if you want a real fun brush you can use, especially when trying to make things like horns, you can press B, which will again quickly open up our brush menu. And we want the snake hook brush. So it starts with S, so press S, which will truncate this all down. And we can scroll on down here to our little snake hook brush, which we can click or press H, because that's the letter for it. Boom. Snake hook brush is a fun one. It's the one that's like the most easy to get into. Oh, you want to make horns? Bleh. And when you make a sound, it makes it like real professional. So when I want to do that kind of stuff, you can pull this out. If you don't want it to be so intense, again, just lower that Z intensity, and you'll get to kind of just pull out again and again, just kind of pull out with that cursor, repeating the process over and over again, and then just drag out into an empty space with control, and you get exactly what you want. Now I've got details to work with here. I can smooth this out and start getting some stuff to work with. Control W can switch me back to move. And if you're not sure how to do that again, just Alt-click on your brushes. You'll get your brush area, find the brush that you want, Control-Alt-click. It'll give you the option of making a hotkey of some sort, and press Control-W to set that. Make sense? Any questions so far? Well, you're basically done. Like, this is the majority of how you do ZBrush stuff. If you want to save it, Control-S will give you the ability to save your whole project. If you wanted to save only the tool by itself, that's useful too. I don't do that most of the time, but if, say, for example, you had some tools that you didn't want, well, you can get rid of them. But in this case, you can just go Save As under our tools, and you're saving the tool. That's it. There is actually pretty much, there's the File section over here, which is actually only recent. Older versions of ZBrush do not have the File menu, right? It's bonkers. But basically, you can save that, and this will save the actual project itself. But this is the majority of what you would be doing inside of ZBrush. So for a practical setup, if I were to sculpt this further, I can kind of go back in time. Now, one thing that's useful is there's this little slider at the top. There's a bunch of little ticks right towards the top here. If you drag between this or click at any given point, yeah. And when you save, by default, it's actually going to save this history, which also means your save time will go up like crazy. But it's in there. Under your preferences, you'll find down here, under our, should be undo history, if I'm not mistaken, save enabled for, enable saving of undo history to file. So your undo history will actually be saved to the file, which is pretty rad. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Yeah.
Where's that bar if you don't have enough already?
This bar?
Yeah.
If you don't have it, that's strange. Cool. If you don't have it, you have an old version of ZBrush. But yeah, so if I wanted to continue kind of sculpting this out a bit more, my process would be this. Basically, I would end up switching to clay buildup, going to probably about 11 or so, or 10, and it'll give me this warning that I've gone back in my undo history to get rid of the horns. Do I want to do that or not? Yes. So I say yes, and I can kind of continue sculpting this out. So I'd potentially start kind of removing some certain sections here, building out these eyes, because at least in the concept from what I recall, there was these really, really goofy, big, bulgy eyes, and I like monsters, so big, bulgy eyes are always fun to me. I press 5 so I can switch to the Damien standard brush, because that's what I use by default. I've got the Z intensity set to like 14, which is pretty low, which means I have to brush over the surface many, many times to kind of create the shape that I want. Now, for example, here, this section is kind of pushing up a little bit too much. I want to droop it down a little bit more. So I could use my move brush and start to pull at some of these polygons here just to kind of pull this down if I wanted to. Or I could use my clay buildup brush and build in along the bottom. Just kind of press, 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 press to build out that surface. And I try to do it relatively lightly so that I'm gradually building up that surface. The harder your brush goes, the harder it is to get nuanced shapes and smooth, small transitions. The clay buildup brush is nice because it'll also create some like pretty hard cuts on your model, which can be pretty convincing and useful in a number of situations. So for example, here, I could start to kind of push this stuff out. If I wanted a brush that's a little bit more bold and big, I could use something like the standard brush. Now the difference between the standard brush and the clay buildup brush is that clay buildup destroys the underlying information and adds something on top. Standard will actually, if I increase the Z intensity, you'll see it a little bit better here. It just basically pushes things out along the axes. Boop, boop, boop. That's basically what it's going to do. So gross. I'm actually like not even trying to make something super gross. I'm just modeling it badly. Now, for example, if I used clay buildup at that same size, what's going to happen is I'm going to just cut stuff out of it. It's basically going to start reducing and smooshing the existing stuff that's underneath. Whereas standard will maintain a lot of the underlying details. For example, if I were to, let's go to a higher Dynamesh count here. Let's just go to 100. And just Dynamesh, it'll take a moment so I can smooth this out. Now, let's say with my clay buildup, I start to kind of create this shape in here. The nice thing about clay buildup is, especially when you've got enough geometry here, enough polygons, your sculpt actually starts to have some form to it. Now, by default, normally it's got this alpha, so you should actually see this shape as you're sculpting, which is a really nice textural look. So I can sculpt, 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 and start getting the kind of shapes that I want from this. And it's going to start filling in gaps really nicely. But if I wanted to just push that geometry, I press 1 to get standard, because that's the shortcut key I set up, and I just push. Standard is going to maintain those underlying surfaces, whereas clay buildup will squish them and create new ones. Make sense? Yeah.
What is the difference between Dynamesh and subdividing? Because like Dynamesh is adding polygons.
Yeah. It's a very good question. So let's go down to a very low resolution. Let's break this thing down. So you can see here we've got this shape. It's very, very low, very, very simple. Now, if I move this geometry here, like this, we can see here we've got a lot of like stretched polygons. What happens when I divide, which I can do again by pressing Control D, the model is now divided. So it smooths it and it divides it. So it adds more geometry and smooths the result out. So you can see here I've got more geometry, but I don't have more geometry. Areas that are already reduced, that are pulled and stretched out, so I get long, thin rectangles, are always going to stay long, thin rectangles. There'll just be more of them. So for example, the easy way to see how this works is if I try to add detail in this space, you'll see I kind of can't.
Yeah.
Like there's not enough. I'll divide it like twice more, which is a lot. I can start to add details in, but any detail I add is really gross. Whereas if I do that same detail where there is geometry, it's a nice clean line. That's because I've got long, thin, let's pull over here. Hard to see, I'm just gonna go lower in that subdivision amount here. Long, thin rectangles. Those don't do me well. So what I want is to actually have, I'm just gonna delete higher here, that.
So it kind of like reinterprets it properly.
Exactly. It takes the shape of your model, but then puts in a whole bunch of extra geometry, each polygon being the size of the resolution. Yeah, so it's very, very handy that way. Now there's another tool, you might have heard of ZBrush is a term that gets used if you're aware of it or not. It also does a similar action, but actually tries to maintain polygonal flow. So for example, if I just press ZRemesher, actually I'm going to escape this real quick because I want to go to the same poly count. Boop. What's going to happen here now is you'll see I've actually got like polygon flow that is actually like semi-usable in theory, whereas this is like just a bunch of junk. That's what ZRemesher does. But here's the caveat. ZRemesher looks a lot more sophisticated than it is, while also being like crazy sophisticated. The fact of the matter is ZRemesher will give you geometry that like looks like it's like really smart and really good and like exactly what you would have done yourself, but it's not. For example, spots like this, right through here, or right through here, you can draw it in. That area there should have an edge loop that wraps around it, but it doesn't because ZRemesher is not actually that smart most of the time. So it'll make foolish mistakes like that. So in this case, generally speaking, Dynamesh is what you want while you're just kind of iteratively sculpting and trying to create form and shape. ZRemesher is what you can use later for more refined work, where you're trying to elaborate on a model. Because then you can start to go to lower subdivision levels and divide because you're done with your design. Generally speaking, Dynamesh is best used, there we go, when you're figuring out your design, when you're still like pulling big shapes out and you don't know what you're doing, and you're just like, I don't know, I want it to be big, like this. There's my creature, I love him like my child. And you're really happy with it, he's got a bigger mouth, perfect. This is where you need Dynamesh because you need it to kind of go back through the model again, and it's fast. ZRemesher takes more time because it's actually trying to do like thoughtful work. Okay, so let me just make sure I'm covering the stuff that I want to. Boop, 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 boop. Yep, this. Symmetry. Let's, how do you get a different symmetry axes? Because maybe you want to do a different kind of symmetry with this guy. This is not a good example for it, but let's say you want to do that. How do you do it? Well, remember when I pressed Alt here to bring up that brush menu? I would suggest Alt-clicking everything, because Alt-clicking is going to open up the appropriate spot for the button that you find on your screen. ZBrush is pretty good at like being able to kind of prod at it and potentially finding what you want, because, say for example, perspective. Oh hey, okay, if I click this perspective button, I see things in perspective, and it shows me what the shortcut key for it is too, which is P. Cool. Where is the actual button for this housed? Because any button that's on my screen right now is housed inside of one of these menus at the top. Every single one of them. So if I Alt-click anything, boop, it's going to dock that information from the Draw, which would be right here, Draw, tab. So in there you can see, oh, okay, cool, there's perspective. But you can also dock any of these things over into these various windows. So for example, if there's menus you want to get access to, you could pull open stuff like this little divider here at the corner. Boop, pull that open, pull this one open, and start docking various things into them. So for example, let's say I want to grab the ones that are fun to do. It's things like ZScript. I can just go to this little spot here and drag over this entire menu into this section. It still stays where it is, but now I can gain quicker access to it, or the Z plugins. Actually, that's the one that I like to deal with, not ZScript. But I get loads of things to deal with, such as FBX export import. This is an important one. For those of you that do 3D work and don't necessarily want to like start modeling something in ZBrush, but want to take something from Max or Maya into ZBrush and start sculpting that, well, this is what you're going to want to use, because by default, click, thank you. I could import right here. Under my tool area, there's import 3D mesh, but this is an OBJ import. OBJ import is fine, but it's super inconsistent. It always requires quads because ZBrush does not like triangles. ZBrush gets like really antsy and weird about triangles, especially older versions if you're using a pirated version. Who knows? Nobody's going to be doing that. None of you are definitely doing that right now. So if any of you were, generally speaking, you're really going to want to use the FBX import export, especially I know if you're using Max. the scale of your object stays a lot more consistent with an FBX import-export. So all you need to do is just go into ZPlugin, and that's where that option is. ZPlugin, FBX, import-export, just a little button in there. That's what you're going to want to work with. Pretty much all the defaults are fine for it, which is nice, and it gets you much more consistent results when you're importing a model from Max. So, cool guy that I got modeled right now. But if I wanted to change the symmetry, well, this is where we fiddle with stuff, because by default, I cannot remember where in this interface that option is. But that's not a big deal. It's kind of one of the weird, quirky, nice-ish things about ZBrush, is you can kind of click things, such as just this local symmetry button, and we get our transform area. Now, in our transform area, is that where you would expect to find our sculpting symmetry stuff? No, absolutely not. It's not where I would have figured to guess where it would be. It's not where most people would expect something to be, but it is. Activate symmetry is right in here. It's activated by pressing X, and it's activated by clicking it. Now, if I turn off the X-axis and turn on the Y-axis, it's going to actually do the Y-axis. Now, Y-axis is like Maya, so it's up and down. If you're used to 3D Studio Max, then the Y-axis is like on the ground. That's just the differences between software. I could also use the Z-axis, which will go, in this case, back to front. But neither of those are useful to me right now. But here's a fun one. It's my favorite, and it always surprises people early on. And it's a great one. So I'm going to just Dynamesh this dude. There we go. So I've got this like cool piece, like really well modeled. Don't laugh. I was serious. There we go. So now I'm going to come back up here into my transform. I'm going to activate symmetry, but I'm going to turn on this little radial symmetry button. Radial symmetry is wicked because it is symmetry that is radial. I know it sounds really obvious, but... So for example here, like this doesn't look that good. This doesn't look that useful. What if I go with the Y-axis instead of the X? Woo! So what if I want to like carve in like a cool something? Maybe like a pillar. Like a real cool guy. Now, hey, what if I want to do a little bit more with this? Well, I can hold Shift to drag in a straight line. It's going to lock it to an axis. So I start to sculpt with Alt, and then hold Shift, and it's going to lock it. Even if I go in this direction, it's going to lock it to that single axis. So I start to create some really quick and easy details on this mesh, and then I can re-Dynamesh it and start to create a lot of really, really simple shapes. And again, if I wanted to increase the radial count, then I can start to kind of pull stuff out a little bit more and create a lot of different kinds of shapes really, really quickly. Ooh, let's kind of pull that in. Pull out some details like this. Create little details like this. And I could press Control-D, for example. I'm not changing the shape drastically, so Control-D actually works pretty decently here. Just divide it a couple times and start to pull out that shape a bit more. Now, what if I wanted to make this like a little bit more hard-edged? Well, this is where the other brush I love comes in, H-Polish. So again, press B to get my brushes. It's the fastest way to get there. And then I can press, it's called H-Polish, H. It's the only H brush, so it immediately picks that brush. But if you needed to find it, it's in here under, I'm so not used to looking for them. There we go, H-Polish. Basically what this brush is going to do is give you like a sort of polish. It's going to be the dumbest explanation. It's going to polish your object kind of into a flat sheen. It's generally going to be trying to make a flat surface. So for example, if I push along here, a little bit harder to see, let's go a bit bigger. And it's going to sort of flatten out and polish these areas. Now, it can tend to, if I go to a higher resolution here, make flat surfaces more often than not. It generally tries to flatten to something like flat. But if you're working with a smooth surface, a rounder surface, and you want to maintain the curvature of that shape, but you want to sort of like smooth it out without using the smooth brush, because that's going to kind of destroy underlying surfaces in an unpleasant way, circular motions. Just delicate circular motions will soften that out and make it work really nice. What if you hold Alt? Alt is going to push the surface out. So it's going to, most brushes will be pushing up, so it'll come out, but holding Alt will push them in. Some brushes are the inverse of that. How do you know? Well, you can usually see up here, Z add, in this case, is the default for H polish, which is actually completely undermining the point I was about to make, which is that it was going to tell you that it's Z sub, but it's not doing that, so I'm actually like super wrong right now. But in this case, it's just going to prove me wrong. Generally speaking, you should be able to tell, but not here. Lucky me. But basically, hold Alt, and now the surface is going to actually push out. If I do this a lot, with a lot of Z intensity, normally it pushes out a lot more than this. It's being a bit of a fool with me right now. There we go. Whoop. That's H polish. It's still pushing out a lot by holding Alt, so it can also still push in to that same degree if I really wanted it to. So I could polish this right in there and get this pretty neat result pretty quickly. Where did that floor come from? There we go. So that works really nicely for kind of blocking in some big basic shapes. I've got too many points here right now, so it's actually cutting in a lot more geometry than it should be. But if I wanted to, I just lower down that amount back to like 8 or however many points were up here at the top. And then I can still start to get those big basic shapes that I want and sculpt in on both sides. Make sense? So radial is really, really useful. If I wanted to extend this shape, then we can start getting into the tool that makes no sense by default, the transpose tool. Oh, I just saw like a face get really sad at transpose. Have you used transpose before? Yeah, so transpose is a very misunderstood tool because it is like, it doesn't want you to understand it. It's an introvert tool, and it also just does not want to be friends with people. So if you press, for example, W, E, R, you're going to get our move, scale, and rotate tools. Hey, just like Max or Maya. Oh, awesome. So I'm going to get like a gizmo that I can move stuff around. Yeah, perfect. You know, just like that. This thing. So you drag off of your model in any direction, or even on top of your model, and you get 3 points, 3 circles. Huh. Now, to be clear, ZBrush 4R8 actually like just came out like 2 days ago. Literally 2 days ago, was released publicly. They have a gizmo now. Like you have to press Y on your keyboard and you get like a traditional gizmo with rotate and all the appropriate stuff. It looks really nice. I haven't played with it yet because I had to do this, so I was like, I'm gonna wait. But it's like a traditional, normal human gizmo. But the transpose tool has benefits. For example, an object like this, using the transpose tool, I can very quickly just kind of pull out certain sections here. So for example, with this, I could pull this out. In here, I could pull this up. Let's go like this. Whoop. That's pretty good. So by using the transpose tool, I actually get a fair amount of control. In fact, with the transpose tool, I can do things like this pretty quickly, just straight on top of the mesh, which seems unexpected given your faces and you're going, what? The problem is that it's also totally bonkers. So here's how this works. What transpose is doing. First off, when you use the transpose tool, it's the exact same between scale, rotate, and move. But let's start with move. So what you want to do, drag anywhere on your mesh. You always have to start on the mesh and drag it into an empty space. Cool. Done. If you click on the middle circle where it's white, you click on the inside of it, not the outside, and you drag. You are now moving your mesh. Cool. But you have to click on the inside. If you click on the outside, then you're moving the transpose tool location. Yes. And it seems like it's crazy, and it is. And again, I shouldn't use the word crazy, I'm sorry. But again, it seems unreasonable in every way to expect a person to figure out this kind of stuff. But we can start moving this around. Cool. Now, if I click the bottom one, it's going to cut my mesh into a tiny piece. What? Okay, so now I'm going to grab this top one, and it's going to scale. What? Huh? basically what's happening is by default, this brush, this tool, is going to say, okay, well, this is the pivot point of your movement. So our moving is kind of a translation. It's going to move the shape. So in this case, when I grab the center, it's just moving the entirety of it, as if it's its whole. If I grab the end point, it's going to scale or push it out, or skew it, basically along that axis. Now, why does this bottom section move? So when I drag this out, the bottom goes too. Well, the bottom goes because this point here doesn't reach below it, because this is the pivot point for that movement. Think of it like an FFD, or a freeform deform, or a lattice if you're using Maya. Basically, wherever those bottom sections are, when you push the rest up, it's going to do the same. And here, this is, hey there, hi. It's basically going to be pushing out in a symmetrical direction. So when I click up here, I can pull this out, and now that bottom section doesn't push out in the same way. Now, how did I do that previous result, where I kind of just pulled the top section? Alt. The Control and Alt keys do a lot of stuff inside of ZBrush. So here, for example, if I hold Alt and I start doing this, what's happening? Well, what's happening here is from this point to this point, I'm doing that same scale or sort of move operation. To get a better sense of how we can do that, I can drag up from here. And now from here to here is the distance that's going to get pulled, and this end section will stay the same. So now if I pull from here, the rest of this goes up. I could also pull this down, and now it just looks like that section's moving on its own. Because this section from here to here is what's actually being scaled. As you can see, let's zoom in real close so you can see that, is what's happening in there. So then I would Dynamesh again. So the pivot point location of that base point is what's going to cause everything to happen. So with the transpose tool, again, if I drag out onto the mesh, it's going to go also in the direction of my normals. So it's going to constrain itself to the shape of my object, which won't be apparently useful in this example because it's just absolutely not. But if I drag out, then it's going to go in the angle of my view. If I hold shift at any point, then it's going to lock this piece to my view angle as well. So I can kind of always position it to wherever I'm looking if I wanted to by just holding shift, and it'll lock that in, and I could pull stuff out and do whatever I want. Yeah.
Sorry, how do you get the transpose tool again?
WER, just like in Max or Maya, or these little buttons up here. Move, scale, and rotate. So scale, and this is why, again, ZBrush can be really, really frustrating, and it's why we cover a bunch of these basics, and it's why there will be, again, a video for this so you can come back to it and be like, transpose what? Scale, you can do in the same way. Again, you drag it out, and if you want to scale, well, we could grab this center point, and what? Maybe it's not consistent. Because what you want to do is actually grab this endpoint and you scale the object up. Perfect. Well, what if you want to scale down? Okay, well, let's scale down and scale back. Excuse me. Scale down, scale back up. Excuse me. Scale down, and why does it scale back up? Because you'll have this happen a million times, especially if you make your shape small. Then you'll scale down, excuse me. Basically, what's going to be happening every single time is when you scale down to that center point, remember everything beyond this pivot point is symmetrical. So you scale down, and after it passes that point, you're now reversing your operation and scaling back up. Why does it do that? Oh, ZBrush. What a fun weirdo. So again, all you need to do is just drag that out from this point, and when you scale down, instead of continuing, just stop, scale down, scale down. So you do that multiple times. It's not the only way to scale something inside of ZBrush, but it is the one that uses the transpose tool. Now for rotate. Rotate is one of the more interesting ones that you can get some really neat results out of, but as with all of these tools, takes getting used to and understanding what it's doing. So by default, for example, rotate's kind of work the way that you expect, which is nice. You grab a point from the outside and you rotate it. From the inside, it works a bit differently. this basically acts like the fulcrum on a hinge, if those are the words that are correct for this. When I do this, everything's going to rotate around that point in existence. So this, wherever it's located, everything will rotate around that. If I go by this axis, then it'll rotate like that, which is pretty handy and pretty useful once you get used to it, but again, a little bit awkward. Lastly, if I hold Alt in this case, it's going to take this section here again and rotate with just that in mind, which is rad. Because now this bottom section doesn't rotate because it's below that point and this point. So that can be incredibly useful in a number of situations. Like this one, perfect, nailed it. Now it's a scary face. But this is also, like honestly, this is one of the fun things with ZBrush, is you can really mess with geometry and then go ahead and turn on something like Dynamesh. Now it's going to ask here, this is a great example. I turned on Dynamesh and it says, oh, your mesh has multiple subdivision levels. What do you want us to do? It's got a couple options here, which is it can freeze my subdivisions. It can say, you've got a bunch of detail. Do you want to like keep it for later to like get back? Which is great. Because basically what it does is it duplicates your model into the background. So let's say, I'm going to say, you know what? Sure, let's do that. So now I've got frozen subdivision levels and I'm presently seeing my lowest division of my model. Cool. Now I can Dynamesh to this like very low subdivision shape. But I lost all that detail. What if I wanted to divide the model once maybe and get that geometry that I had back, that shape, that form? I turn off freeze subdivision levels. And basically what it does is it reprojects your old model, its old shape, back onto the new one. Perfect, right? Usually a bit better than that. But basically it's a projection, which is normally going to result in something better than this. But this was a great example to do in public with people who are watching and assuming that I know what I'm talking about. Generally, I do, but not this time. Generally speaking, it's going to produce a much better result. If you want a better result, generally speaking, there is, let's see here, it is under Subtool, if I'm not mistaken, and Project. Project in here are generally the settings that freeze subdivision stuff will use. But just to be clear, I don't use that stuff that much. Oftentimes, you can just duplicate a model and use projection. But again, blah, advanced. So those are things that you could do that I usually don't. So in this case, for example, to maintain that detail level, if I wanted to, I would just say, hey, these are my geometry levels, my subdivisions. I could go lower, I could go higher, because I pressed Control D at some point. Now I could delete my lower subdivision levels, cool. Or I could delete my higher ones, or whatever I want. Now if I say, for example, Dynamesh without doing any of that, does it want me to freeze subdivision levels before Dynameshing? Nah. Boom. Just going to immediately Dynamesh. Now, if I wanted to maintain more of that detail, well, I just go to a higher resolution. Let's go 100 in this case. Dynamesh, ignore its warnings, and I get a more detailed piece. But the nice thing here is I could go, hey, you know what? This is actually a pretty cool thing that's happening here right now. I'm going to turn on my symmetry. I'm going to come back into my symmetry area here. Just Alt-click a couple times. It'll show up. Turn off my radial. Make sure, now in this case, you can see, for example, that my radial or my symmetry is not in the right orientation. So I just need to actually switch the axes, probably to X. And still things are not quite correct because I've been rotating and moving this thing. So we need to get our symmetry set back up. There's two ways we can do this. First off, remember that little local symmetry button that I clicked to get in here? That piece is really handy because it's going to look at the bounding box of your model, the entire frame and shape of your piece, and say, well, that is where my symmetry will be within. I'm going to go in the center of that. So now this shows up just fine. But if I wanted this to be a bit more correct, the option's not here by default. That's too bad. But we can get to it. Basically, if this is not where I want it to be, I can go over here into my transform area. Again, I get that by going into my local symmetries or my activate symmetries. There's a little button here called set pivot. And it looks like nothing happened. That's because my camera kind of stayed with my model. But now my symmetry point is right in the center, because set pivot basically takes your model and puts it into the center of the world. If I draw the ground plane here, you can see that there is kind of a center point that this is within right now. I almost never use the floor, and you usually don't need to. So now in this case, for example, I could start sculpting. So I could be like, actually, this looks like a really weird dude. Like another, again, a monster, because I'm like really clever. But hey, that's what I could start working with. So for example, I could start pulling out certain sections here and getting these really interesting shapes that came from like messing around with a pillar. And all of this can be done really nicely and quickly and easily to start getting a really, really interesting shape right away. And if I wanted to get more detail out of it, just re-Dynamesh, cut some pieces in, pull some pieces out here, there we go, and start blocking in some basic shapes and forms for things like eyes, eyebrows. Let's go a little bit higher on that Dynamesh to something like 200. Divide that back up and start smoothing things out. So now I can start building in those big basic shapes. And I've already got a guy that's like actually kind of interesting looking just by a weird chance. And I could start building into all of that stuff, because the mesh generation allows me to like crunch things together and go, I still like it, make geometry good now, Dynamesh, and then start sculpting on top of it, which gives you a lot of accessibility. Now, yeah, oh, hey.
It's happened once.
Yeah.
Me.
Ooh.
Those like kind of missing chunks?
Yeah, these.
Are those like fixable in any way?
No. Sort of, kind of. So basically what's happening here is Dynamesh, every time you've got a model, whether it's open and has a hole in it or is closed, it's always going to try to like reclose it. So anything that's open will always be closed. Dynamesh will create an airtight object where it's going to be fully enclosed. What's happening here is that the mesh has a section that's too thin, and it's having a hard time figuring out if it should have thickness there, and it's projecting its confusion, and it's going, I think there's something here, right here, but I'm not sure if there's something here, so I'm going to get rid of stuff. And so you get a hole in the mesh. This actually happens a lot if you try to Dynamesh a plane. Not like a fly plane, but like a traditional 3D primitive plane. So let's make this a polymesh 3D object. You can see it's got like one side to it and the other side is not there. If I try to Dynamesh this, oh, are you gonna make me look like an asshole right now? Dynamesh, don't do this to me. There we go. I tried to do anything with that one and it broke it. So yeah, you sculpt any stuff like this. Generally speaking, it does a lot more. There we go. That's right. Basically what we get here is that the mesh doesn't know what to do with itself, and it starts to just break apart. How do you fix it on a model where you don't just want to say, I'm sad now, and I need something to happen? So up here, for example, the problems that you can see here is that it's like breaking this into like all these little sections that just aren't going to work. It's a few ways. Well, first off, the easiest one is you need to add shape back in. You need to thicken up those walls. So you could do that. The easiest one with our brushes, press B, and we get inflate. I don't want to look for it because I'm an adult, but here it is. I could also press I, and then it'll show up. So inflate. Inflate brush is going to do exactly what it sounds like. It's going to inflate the shapes in all directions. So it'll be really obvious here. I just push here, and it kind of just like fills it up like a caulking gun. It just, and when I Dynamesh now, all that stuff kind of gets fixed up. And at this point, I could use H-polish or something like that to kind of just clean up this result so that I get something that's a little bit less grotesque. Make sense? That's generally how you fix it, is you need to thicken those walls so that it has shape to work with. If it's happened and you didn't notice it and you wanted it to be nice and clean again, you got to clean it up. It's just a bunch of work. So that's about it. If I wanted to add, say, a body to this weird dude, how do we do that? Well, there's a few things I could do. What's our time like? What are we at? 8:05. So it's been an hour and a half. Do you guys want a break? Are you guys good? Do you want to keep going? Who wants a break? That's always the easiest way to find out. Who would like a break? Oh, don't be shamed. What's yes, keep going. Yeah, it's fine with me. So let's get into then. Let me just make sure I'm covering what I think I should be. Boop, boop, perfect. Masking. Masking is how we edit specific spots where we only deal with certain areas. How do we get to that? Hold Control, paint on your model. Woo! So perfect. So now, when I start to move anything, I'm going to use the move brush for this, for example. Anything that I move is only going to be the sections that I didn't paint. So if I wanted to keep the eyes where they were, but I wanted to move the rest of this, then I can. So I could start to pull some of these sections up and get this weirdo looking the way that I want without moving his eyes. Now, if I wanted to move his eyes, all I need to do is hold Control and click on the empty canvas. Click, it'll invert. If I double click on the mesh with Control still held, because it's going to affect my masking, double click, it's going to blur out my mask. So now I could start moving various parts and make him sad. But now I'm only moving that section. If I wanted to move just the nose, I could hold Control and Alt to paint away various sections on the mesh. So Control will paint, Control Alt will remove. If I Control double click, it'll blur that out, Control click outside the mesh, and then I can start to kind of just move things around and start to make a big nose on this guy. So that he starts looking a lot less mean and a lot more, I guess in this case, very sad. He's got a voice, you know it. So now he's just kind of this sad, sad dude. But if I wanted to, say, pull out certain sections like this, you're seeing that I'm getting this mask. Now remember before, when we weren't selecting anything, it dynameshed. So in here, if I just select nothing, I get a dynamesh if nothing's been selected. But if I actually go over top of my model, the mask will mask things. So I can just Control click to kind of mask or blur this rather. Control double click will blur that. Control click will invert. And I make sure that I've got my move tool selected and just kind of pull this out. The reason that this is useful is because you might want to use a very large brush to make big, broad movements, but you don't want to start messing around with the rest of the head. So for example here, a big, big brush allows me to create nice, big, simple shapes, which is exactly what I want here. But if I add this not masked out, then I'm going to start moving the head, which is obviously not what I want. If you wanted more control over that masking operation, maybe you didn't want just a box, hold Control and click over here. Now my brush options are actually different. I now have brush options for just Control. So in here, for example, I've got Mask Lasso, which is one of my favorite ones. So if I click this, now I have a lasso that I get to use. So I can kind of create whatever shape I want. This means that I can kind of really mask into certain sections, get something like the mouth, potentially use something like transpose and rotate out from a certain point, or move to kind of get some of that shape that I want. Maybe Dynamesh again. Mask out this section of the mouth and start to kind of move it in. So he's got like this really creepy mouth that I'm making that I'm very upset about. Then I could mask out sections like the teeth. Let's just re-Dynamesh this. You'll see, for example, in here, so this is a fun one, in case you get spots like this, where your mesh is kind of overlapping itself, and you're getting this thin little card that you don't want. Does everybody see that? Who doesn't see it? Basically, what I can just do is model anything on top of that. Stuff usually works really well on top of each other, so I could just model in some surfaces on top of this. Maybe smooth it out, maybe use H-polish to kind of flatten that in. Now that mesh is still there as a sort of separate piece on top, but if I Dynamesh, hey battery, oh wait, where's the plug? I've got my thing for this, but this is full. Will it reach? Nope. Okay, and then can I pull that over here still a bit more? Perfect. That should be enough. There we go. So now you can see I've got this like little gap here where stuff still had a gap going on. Again, I usually just use H-polish and it kind of fills in these various pieces, fills it in, re-Dynamesh, and then I get the shape that I want. Now, one thing with mask lasso is it actually goes through your model, so it will be on the other side of this piece as well, which is obviously not what I want in this scenario. So hold Control, and I can just switch this back to mask pen, which means that I just kind of brush on top of the surface to create the mask that I want, and I can kind of just pull some teeth out of that. Now notice here that my mesh is not actually symmetrical. Some things are like non-symmetrical in this case. How do I fix that? How do I make it symmetrical? Well, when it comes to your model, you're going to have a lot of pieces that are going to potentially not work exactly the way that you want. So in our geometry area, there is our modify topology section. This is where you'll deal with a lot of modifying the geometry, modifying your topology. In this case, what we want is mirror and weld on the x-axis or whatever the axis is that's appropriate. So if I press mirror and weld, you'll see here that the axis that I picked was the wrong one. It's a cool shape if I wanted like this thing, but it's not what I want. So in this case, what I need is to pick the correct axis, which is the z-axis. Now this is a bit finicky to click, but it's just that little z. But in this case, I pressed it when both of them were turned on, and it did it. So it's a bit finicky to click. You'll get used to it. Again, this is from a person who did not get used to it and hated it for a long time. Like I say, just like settle in and just like let the weirdness just kind of like wash over you. And you'll be a lot more comfortable with it over time. So again, that z-axis in this case is the correct axis for me. And now I can get that going where I want it to so that I can mask out certain sections here and start to create the shape that I want. And the reason that I like using ZBrush is exactly for this reason. I can get like a fair amount of detail out of a mesh really quickly and easily and start creating things that are like pretty interesting right off the bat and start to have interesting shapes and forms and start to build off various kinds of design details and design choices that give me just tons and tons of flexibility. Like with a nose, for example, I can just think about, okay, I just want to make a nose. I can just think about the structure of a nose and not necessarily be caught up in, well, what's the topology, like how to get the topology of a nose to work right. Because the topology on a nose sucks. It's really hard to get right and have the shape work well and keep quads and stuff if you're trying to do that. Ugh. So in this case, you can just focus on, I just want to make a big bulbous nose. I'm going to just build into these large forms down here, make some of those sections of the nose here, build in some of the cartilage structure, maybe take out some right here, build in some of the eyebrows, and you're just thinking about form and shape. And when we want to add more detail to it, we can divide it if we like the form that we've already got, or we can start to just increase our Dynamesh resolution to something higher. Like here, for example, like 400 and stuff like that, that's much higher than what I was working with previously. That's just because this mesh is smaller. Like I shrunk it with my scale transpose. So now it requires a higher resolution than it did before. Does that make sense? Because resolution is based on the scale. So in this case, I can start kind of just building out these forms using that damn standard to kind of pull things in. But what if I want to deal with the eye? And what if I want the eye to kind of fit into this a lot better? Now I'd have to sculpt it in, which could work, but what if I want an actual eyeball shape to actually just go in there and be an eye? Well, I need multiple tools. I need another object. So there's a few ways that we could do this. First off is with a brush called Insert Mesh. So Insert Mesh in this case would be an insert sphere, which is right there. So an insert sphere is literally going to, when I click this, it's going to drop a sphere onto my mesh, which is pretty handy. If I make a hole for it in the first place, make a hole for this. Let's just kind of carve out where the eye socket would be. Pick my insert cylinder and drop that in. Now, of course, this is not where I want this to be, but I could control click to invert and start kind of pulling out the eyelids. And actually having an eyeball on top of this, so that I get some of this actual shape here. Now, in this case, I do need to build in the rest of that like head structure. But that's one way of doing this, which is perfectly fine. Now I've got eyeballs. But if I Dynamesh, they're all going to become one mesh. So not necessarily what I want in this case. If I wanted the eyeballs to always stay eyeballs, I need a subtool. So a subtool is a tool inside of a tool. I know that seems rather obvious when you say it, but let's just go back. There we go. So I've got the eye sockets. So I want to append in a subtool. So if I go up here in my tools area to subtool, I get a whole bunch more options here, and I get this big list. Now you can think of subtools like extra meshes in your 3D file, which are things that you can just use in this piece by itself. So, for example, down here in append, I can just say append, and that is how you bring in a new tool into your existing subtool. That's it. I can pick any one of these. In this case, I'll pick a sphere 2D. Just click that. Perfect. Bleh, where'd my object go? Generally, append is a bit annoying in the sense that my object is there. It's just you can't see it because the sphere is as big as my model. It's perfectly fine. I just need to scale down that sphere. So now you can see here I've got two pieces. I've got that sphere, which by default will always be instantly editable. I don't need to turn it into a polymesh 3D object. Anything that you append into an actual object is a sculptable one. So in here, I'm going to use that transpose. I'll just drag out this transpose tool, click that endpoint, and just scale in until I get to that little pivot towards the center, and just stop and come back. Actually, I'm going to go to, let's go to this side where I think it'll screw up on me. So now I can use my transpose tool to kind of just move this into position by picking the angle that I want, holding shift to drag out the transpose tool, and going where I need to. Now I can kind of actually make this the size that I want. I can also still scale it up by going to my scale tool, scaling it up, moving it in. There we go. Now what if I wanted it to appear on the other side? Easy. Scroll on down, back to my geometry area, under my modify topology. Remember mirror and weld? Well, let's just make sure that this is still set to the z-axis. Press that, and it'll appear on the other side. Perfect. It's going to basically just duplicate it and mirror it. That's what mirror and weld does. It's like the symmetry modifier in Max, if you're used to that one. Now, if, for example, let's just see here, I'm going to mess this up for myself so that you run into the issue that I absolutely know you'll run into. For sure. Let's say your eyeball was on this side. Perfect. We go into geometry and we say mirror and weld, and then it says the resulting 3D mesh does not contain any polygons. That's because what's happening in this case is that side of the model is the area that it's trying to duplicate onto. So in this case, mirror and weld is not smart. It's taking from the In this case, I guess the positive side of the mesh, so Z plus, and it's trying to copy it onto Z negative. But in this case, my information is actually on the other side. So it's taking nothing and putting it onto something and getting rid of it. Does that make sense? So what I need to do is mirror this first. All I need to do is do that in either moving it, like if I just move it to the other side of the head and I do my mirror and weld, I'm good to go. However, if your model is actually symmetrical and you can't just move it to the other side, all you need to do is go down into our deformation tab. So deformation is a toolbox for being able to kind of deform things in a broad, very, very simple way. Again, ZBrush 4R8, the new version that's just come out, has a lot of like actual deforming like modifiers that look really, really, really good, like lattices and things like that are very useful for ZBrush, but are not in this version. So you got this. So I just want to point out, of these tools, like a lot of them are really useful. Like I think like 3. That was a joke. It's one where I'm being very sarcastic. Most of these tools are not useful. The fact of the matter is I could use things like offset, which will literally just move, like it looks really gross. But basically I'm just moving this on the Z-axis. I could rotate on the Z-axis. I could scale. Scale is a useful one because, hey, maybe you don't need to use the actual scale transpose, but you could use the size one. So the size will just kind of increase the size of that object. The bend in this case will bend the object. Skew will skew it. Skew will smooth skew it. What's that mean? R-flatten will R-flatten it. Flatten will, there's just all these other ones you don't want to use about 90% of the time because they're super finicky and inconsistent. The ones you do want are going to be polish by features, by groups, by crisp edges. Things like inflate and inflate balloon tend to be pretty nice. But that's about it. The main ones you want are scale and up here, mirror. So if I mirror on the Z-axis, it's going to take my model and mirror it. Let's do the same up here. Let's make a non-symmetrical change here. Bloop, mirror. Perfect, thanks. Hey, click Z. There we go. There we go. See, it's dancing. So let's just undo all of that. I don't mean to keep him dancing. There we go. So now this piece, if I mirror it, boom. Now I can do my mirror and weld. Ta-da. So I'm pointing that out because it will definitely happen to you all the time. So now we've got this guy pretty much looking pretty interesting. If you want to switch between subtools, just Alt-click. All subtools become very, very frustrating if you do not know this one neat hack, this one weird trick for using subtools. Where basically now I can start to edit things, move things around without actually moving the eyes, and I can make this very sad thing. So that's about it. Those are some of the big basic structures. If I wanted to do things like make a body, well, then it's really useful to start using subtools. So again, I could append in a sphere, Alt-click it to just get access to it. I don't even really need to worry about what's going on in here because I can just Alt-click various subtools. Then I can use my transpose, move it around. I could use my transpose to scale this down. Maybe use transpose to kind of move this into position to maybe be a body. Use my symmetry. Again, I've got to change my symmetry axes to the Z-axis because that's the orientation that I'm working with here, and start just kind of pulling out a big wood body. I don't know what this guy's going to be, but again, I can start kind of just pulling things out and moving things around to kind of figure out what I want to work with. Because the geometry can stay pretty simple in this situation, that'll work pretty good. But I could still go down into my Dynamesh to a really low division. There we go. Smooth things out and start to get the kind of proportions that I might want for something like this. So this might be pretty good, but I want to deal with maybe a bit of a nicer torso, sort of rib cage structure that builds into the hips. So what I could do, use my transpose and duplicate my geometry. Easy. Hold Control and click this little middle point and drag down, and you immediately duplicate the mesh that you've got. So just to show that again, just drag out from here, hold Control, and you can pull this out. Like I can still skew it and all that stuff, but now it is this like duplicated version of my mesh, which I could then continue sculpting. So I could kind of pull this back in, start to work with this here, and start to try to change the shape of this so that I've got kind of this reasonable abdomen thing going on. And start breaking those shapes down a bit more. Or I could duplicate this subtool by itself. So let's just go back a little bit so you can see the options. In this case, I could just go duplicate. Shortcut for that is Control-Shift-D, which apparently is just not working on this one. There we go, it's fine. So now I could just drag this down because it's a duplicate, which means I still get a lot more control over this piece, and when I Dynamesh, things will not Dynamesh together. So I can still maintain the shapes that I want, but still Alt-click this and get the other details that I want. So I could make, you know, big monster pecs or something. I just keep making monster pecs. That's just my jam. I don't know why. But I could duplicate this again, and I could potentially pull this over to the side. Pull this over to the side, scale it down. I said scale it down. Smooth it out. Pull it into position and get a shoulder to work with. Let's just Dynamesh again. The reason I want to work with these like very low resolution meshes is so that I can basically just smooth them out and get the shape that I want right away. So that as I start to kind of pull this around, I'm blocking in the proportions, and I can still use that mirror and weld under geometry. Where are we here? Mirror and weld. Boom. Oh, wrong axes. I need the Z. Finicky little button to click. There you go. Make sure my symmetry is turned on. And then start to kind of pull out the various pieces that I want to work with. So now I've got some arms. And again, I still maintain a lot of control over what I'm working with at any given point. Hold Control again just to kind of move this stuff around. And the various other pieces get masked away automatically. Oh, no, that's fine. I wasn't looking at you like, oh, what are you doing? What face are you making at me? So again, if I want to rotate that stuff, just think about where your pivot point should be, and you can drag out from there. So this is where I want my rotation to come from. So with my rotate, I can kind of rotate out from that point and pull down to get some of that shape that I might want. And then again, at this point, I can kind of just like sculpt away on the various pieces to get all the kinds of details that I want. And if I wanted to keep these separated, well, I can easily do that as well. We start to get in what is called polygroups. So for example, right now, if I say Shift F, I can see these are all the exact same color, which means they are the exact same polygroup. Polygroup, we're starting to get into like more advanced stuff. Polygroups are very useful because they allow you to kind of quickly and iteratively hide various things that are inside of the same tool. There's also a number of functions that exist purely based on polygroups. The first one we can deal with here is going to allow us to still keep these things separated as Dynamesh objects, which is really useful. So for example here, I really kind of want to keep these things separate, but I want to add more detail, or I want to split them up. Now ZBrush has no real way of splitting these up at the moment. If I go into my subtool area, there are some split options you can see here, but in this case, there's not necessarily the stuff that I want. This actually might do it literally, but let's do the more complicated one. Split to parts might actually just take these various mesh shells, which is what those should be, and split them into various subtools. but there will be too many in this case. So I want to split this up a little bit more reasonably. So let's go down here into our polygroups section. Now for me, I'm going to want to just do auto groups. Boom. So what's going to happen here is when I click auto groups, all of these will get different colors. Each color is for a different polygroup. Which colors mean what? Doesn't matter. It's actually completely irrelevant. It's only if a color matches does it matter, because then it means that it's in a similar polygroup. Colors are just the designation for different groups. So for example, this becomes useful because I could scroll up here into my subtool area and say group split, which will split each one of these into their own subtool. I'm going to do this and I'll clean it up. So I can say group split, says it's not an undoable operation. Anytime you take a subtool out of another subtool or anything out of a tool, it's going to be an undoable operation because it's going to basically remove my entire undo line. So I'll say that. And now you'll see if I alt click, I've got all these various pieces, and you can see my subtool list is now a little bit horrendous. Perfectly fine to have these many, but I don't really want them. If you've got a subtool you want to get rid of, just go to delete. Boop. Not an undoable. It is an undoable operation. Say OK. And you get rid of it. You can click this one. Alt click. Now what's happening here is basically my cursor, my brush, is big enough that it's touching this other edge. So when I'm alt clicking, nothing's happening. All I need to do is just reduce the size of that or click further away, and I'll get access to this. Basically, it wants to make sure that I'm not actually trying to click something else with alt, like such as brushing. So it makes sure that you're definitely not clicking the mesh that it thinks you're already clicking. So here I can just go delete, say OK, delete, OK, perfect. So now these pieces I could mirror and weld if I wanted to get them duplicated over to the other side, and I'd be perfectly set up. Or in this case, if I wanted to combine them back together, I've got my merge options. Just like layers in Photoshop, I can merge down. You can see my list here, so I could just say merge down, say OK. In fact, one of my shortcut keys is Control E, which is the same as merge down inside Photoshop. So Control E will always just merge down for me. If you want to create that for yourself, again, just Control Alt, click, merge down, and press Control E. There you go. You got it. That's one thing I absolutely love in ZBrush is anytime you think of making a shortcut key, you can just do it. There's no other menus you have to go into. So in here, I can just now grab this guy. And if I go into my, where are we here? Mirror and weld, I've got the other arm on the other side. And you'll notice now, these are the exact same color because their polygroups are the same. Fun thing, Control-Shift, click. When you Control-Shift click a single polygroup, it hides the other ones. So now they're hidden and I can't see them. There we go. So when you click one and then you Control-Shift click out of it, you'll get all of your meshes showing back up again, all of the polygroups. If you Control-Shift click the same mesh again, it's going to hide it but show everything else. If you Control-Shift click one of the remaining pieces, it's going to start subsequently hiding each subsequent one until you go to that last one, and then it's going to sort of flip again. Basically just, I want to see this one. Actually, wait, no, I don't. I don't even want to see this one. All just with Control-Shift click. Control-Shift click is generally dealt with the showing and hiding of objects. For example, Control-Shift click drag is going to show only the geometry that I had selected. Control-Shift click drag and down here will show just this, including any of the polygons that I hit. So if I go to this face, for example, then I only see that top section. Control-Shift click even through the center of it will just show that little piece there. This is useful if you've got like a really dense mesh, like really, really dense, but you only want to deal with this small section here, and you don't want to have your computer, if it's like not dealing with it well, rendering all that stuff that you're trying to sculpt, then you just hide everything else with Control-Shift drag. In this case, because I'm Control-Shift dragging into an empty space, it's just inverting that, which is kind of neat, but not what I want in this case. So I just Control-Shift click, it'll show everything. If you want to hide information instead of show, Alt. So I'm not even holding anything, and because I've already dragged, then I'm able to see the green. If I hold Alt, then it switches to red, and it's going to remove that information. So that's useful, again, if you're trying to like get a really dense mesh and you don't want your computer to be rendering everything all at once. That's often where it's used, especially early on. So that is a bunch of the main stuff. So let's load up one of the guys that I was intending on working with, which is... no. Oh, are you really going to do this? You were already supposed to be downloaded. Oh, no. No, we're not going to play this game. You were downloaded before. It's fine. I can do all that I need to do with this guy right now. So, this guy, maybe we want to add a piece of armor to him. This is, again, one of the things that's incredibly useful inside of ZBrush is mesh generation. So, what I'm going to do is go in here and just combine some of these pieces together, so that I've got sort of the torso structure together. So in this case, I'm just going to Control E, which is my shortcut key for merging down. It's not an undoable, it is an undoable operation. I'm gonna say okay, and I'm gonna say okay again, and just have this go through. So now all of these various pieces are all separated into one single subtool. If I wanted to split them back up, easy, I just go down to Split, and I say Group Split. So then they can immediately go back into their individual subtools, which I can do at any time. Now here, for example, what I am going to do is make a shoulder pad, like maybe some piece of armor, because that's fun in ZBrush, but can be confusing and finicky and weird to do. Let's just check my time here, make sure that we're good. Yeah. So now one thing that I do want to do, because we're going until 9:30, right? Yeah. I guess easy question for you guys, because in the end, I want to make sure you guys are getting what you want out of this. We can cover doing a shoulder pad, or if you guys want to practice stuff yourselves right now and I can help individually, I'm happy to do either. Raise your hands for just continuing demo. Yeah. Just continuing demo, raise your hand. If you want me to continue just demoing stuff, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you want me to come and help you with individual things. Okay, so that's, you're actually, oh, well, you just put it over. So I'll do a little bit of demoing and I'll do a little bit of individual help. We'll mix it up that way because a bunch of you didn't respond, Andrew. Have an opinion, man. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna mask this section out right here. I could just do this section by itself or just the shoulder, doesn't really matter. But I can scroll on down here into Extract. Extract is inside of my subtool palette. Scroll on down here into Extract, and I can click Extract. What that's going to do is basically create a temporary new mesh. And it's going to have these features. It's going to be smoothed out, and it's going to have a certain amount of thickness. Now, if I click or do anything, it's going to go away, because it's not an actual mesh yet. It's just kind of representing what that shape might be for me. And it's going to make it off of these various pieces, which is fine. So for example, if I were to mask out from this section here and extract, it's going to create like a chest plate, which because I've got multiple subtools right now, it's what I'm going to do just to keep things a little bit cleaner and simpler. But you can still do the same process with these larger sections. So for now, I've got extract, but it's not technically there until I click accept. So if I click accept, bang. Now, that piece of geometry is actually there. So I'm going to click it, my cool chest plate, turn off the masking that's on it, and you'll see I've got a few features that are in this right now. First off, you'll see that I've got multiple subtools. So for example, this outer section has one subtool. This intersection, which is connected, is another subtool. And the inside is another subtool. And even this piece that happened to show up in here, which might have just been like a single polygon that I accidentally highlighted from the shoulder, which was a separate mesh, it now extracted its own piece. So two separate sections got masked, and each pixel got turned into its own extraction. Make sense? I don't want all that. So what I'm going to do is get rid of it because I want a simple shape to work with. Zooming. There we go. So now what I'm going to do is just Control-Shift-Click just to get this piece by itself. So now we just got these lovely chest caps. And, you know, and basically, I want that other stuff to not be there anymore. Because keep in mind, I've hidden it. I've Control-Shift-Clicked. Now the other geometry is hidden. But I don't want it there anymore. I hate it. So what I want to do instead is get rid of it. Maybe I didn't even want the thickness to be that size. Maybe I wanted the thickness to be bigger, but now I've made so many decisions with my life, I've got to move on. So what I'm going to do is go down into Geometry, scroll down here into my Modify Topology. Remember that place is where I'm going to come back to a lot, and say Delete Hidden. Delete Hidden will delete hidden. Anything that's hidden is now gone. It's gone forever. You put it in the grave. This is what I've got now. Congratulations to me. This is all that's there. If I Control-Shift-Click, nothing's coming back. Now I can start moving this around by itself, and I can do other things with it. So for example, I could start turning on my symmetry, which is again not on the axes that I want by default. Let's turn that onto the Z and start pulling this in. It is now going to be a chest piece, but I'll still get some functionality with this. So it is just going to be chest caps, but it's what we'll do. If I wanted to, I could still kind of pull it over top of the shoulder, just kind of pulling this out into the position that I want it to be in. If you hold Alt on your Move tool on any kind of mesh, it's going to actually push it out along the axes of the normals. So for example here, just kind of pushes that out. So I could start to kind of just pull this over here if I wanted to, smooth it out a little bit. Now one thing you'll find is a mesh that has empty spaces here. When I smooth it, I'm holding Shift, I'm smoothing, nothing's happening. That's because smooth doesn't really work on those border edges, which can be a pain. That you can use the deformer for, or there is a smooth brush, smooth groups, that would allow you to do that. But in this case, we can just use the deformation, polish. Polish will polish this thing out. You want like a very low threshold for that in the moment here, or polish by features, which will kind of smooth out those larger surfaces. So I could still kind of like pull this around here. If I used my snake hook brush, just press H here will give me that. I can get some pretty good functionality with this. And I could start to kind of pull it into a position that I want, or do polish by features again, or polish entirely. There's lots of ways that I could do this to get the shape that I want. But if this was just I was finding it was really, really cumbersome, or I didn't like working with just a flat plane, a lot of people feel that way, it's fine. Basically what you want to do is just pop back up in here into our Geometry tab. I come back to this a lot. Under Edge Loop, we have a great feature called Panel Loops. Panel Loops is going to take any flat piece of geometry that you've got, or multifaceted, multi-polygrouped, and basically extrude it and give a little bevel shape on that section, which is really cool. So for example, if I just do this by default, let's just make sure that let's polish the features here just so we see this a little bit more clearly. Okay. Panel loops by itself, boom. Perfect. What happened? So basically what's happening in here is a very, very small change. Oh, I clicked you. You're fine. There we go. You son of a... There you go. You can see here, tiny, tiny little bevel. It's basically extruded it out, and we get a little bit of a bevel shape right in here. Whoop, right in here. The problem is it's not very noticeable. Let's increase the thickness. And in case you lose your mesh at any point, there is frame, fit to view. That'll pop your model back into the center. So in here, I'm just going to undo until that kind of goes away. There we go. So now let's increase the thickness of my panel loops to something like that. And you see this a lot better. So now you can see it's created this bevel shape that wasn't there before. The bevel shape is based on this bevel profile. So it's creating this sort of tapered bevel. if I get rid of one of these points, for example, and do this instead, then I get more of that kind of design. Pretty handy. You get a number of loops that you can work with in here. So I could have way less loops, which will actually give me no bevel shape whatsoever, because it doesn't have enough of extra loops on that interior section. But this basically gives me the option of, if I add just a few more loops here, let's go 5 where the default was, and let's just make that. There we go. So now this piece, I could potentially smooth it out and use it a lot better as a shoulder pad for modeling it out. Because now smoothing works a little bit more logically if you're having any kind of trouble with that stuff. But now it's maybe the kind of proportion that I wanted, and I could create the kind of shape that I want, still pretty functionally. If you wanted to do this by default, as I was doing in the first place, Dynamesh the whole piece, the shoulder section, so that each part isn't a separate polygroup and a separate actual physical model. Because then it would all just mesh together and you'd get one big extraction. Whoop, thank you. So now I can kind of pull this out. And this is, again, why I really like ZBrush, is I can kind of pull these sections around, fill these things up. If I wanted this to be a bit thicker, my deformation tab, inflate, works really great when things are just a bit too thin. And you want the whole thing to just kind of be thicker. So I can start to just kind of pull these sections up. The move tool I use a lot in the design process. When I'm trying to figure out what it is that I want to do with a shape, I start to use the move tool a lot, changing the proportions of it, changing the size of it, until it's kind of doing what I want it to. Let's pull this section in. There we go. So to get flat shapes like that, basically I'm just pulling this whole thing out, but using small distance movement and small scale movement just to kind of push in these front vertices so that it starts to look a little bit more flat. Now I can kind of pull out sections like that, and I start to get some shoulder pads. But what if I wanted something cleaner? What if I wanted to be like a real cool modeler and not have this swoopy blobby shape? There's 2 ways that we can do this. First off, this is a pretty swoopy blobby shape. That's the scientific term. But basically, if I come up here and I say Dynamesh, where are we here? I want my Dynamesh back. Dynamesh. So if I come in here into Dynamesh, I'm going to turn off project because, again, I just don't want it. Get Dynamesh right away. This is where I just test my resolution, see if that's enough. That's actually pretty good. In this case, I'll kind of smooth it out a little bit. Dynamesh, smooth out this result a little bit more. And I'm going to turn on something called polish. So auto apply a clay polish to my Dynamesh. So when I do this, it's going to kind of polish out some of the pieces. It's also going to make the geometry a little wacky. So in here, for example, it's not a great example. Let me just polish out some of these pieces. So I'm going to use H polish here. Start to polish out these sections so that I get some kind of hard edges, or some sections that are going to look a little bit more hard. To sort of get some of this kind of shape that I want. Kind of just lightly brushing across some of these surfaces. Let's get this here. Let's get this back section. Use Alt to kind of pull this section up because I'm losing a little bit of form right here. Can use Alt to kind of just pull this section up. Resculpt along this side by just pushing down without Alt. Smooth that out. I'm going to use the Move brush just to kind of pull this transition over in the center and pull this one over. Just so that that line stays nice and straight instead of being so curved. There we go. Then I can use H polish over here. Again, holding Alt sometimes to kind of just push it back up to fill in certain gaps. There we go. So now it's pretty creased, but it's still kind of bumpy, kind of blobby in a number of spots. So again, with polish turned on, I can go over top of this. And what polish is going to do is re-Dynamesh it, but apply an operation called clay polish, which basically starts to push geometry towards the edges and applies a quick little polish operation on it, which basically just makes things look a little bit cleaner and a little bit crisper. Without it, an operation like this will look something like this. The edges along here will get frayed and kind of nasty looking. The problem is it's a little bit harder to sculpt detail into a polished mesh, into a specifically clay polished mesh. So that's just a sort of setting that you've got to get quite the way you want it. For example, in here, I could turn on clay polish. That'll kind of clean that up a little bit. But then I could go to a much higher resolution, turn off clay polish. Hey, go much higher. Okay, you're not working with me here. Clay polish, there we go. So it'll take a moment, but especially at these higher resolutions, you do not need project turned on because it'll pretty much just project out all the details anyways. So now you can see here, I've got a lot better detail than I had before, but this mesh is really dense. Ooh, it's crashing my computer. Undo. Undo. Pray for me. Oh. Now in this case, for example, it is not likely crashing. Oops. Okay, I'm going to delete this mesh because it's making me very concerned. So I'm just going to delete it and show you the other option of doing this. Boom. Delete. I don't trust it. So for example, remember when I was saying this piece here? If we wanted to do this all at once without having to manipulate and move things, quick and easy, all we need to do is just Dynamesh it. Geometry, I could duplicate this model first if I wanted to just have a temp version. I'm not going to in this case. I'm just going to Dynamesh. Boop. Perfect. So in this case, I'm going to select this section here, mask it out. There we go. Perfect. Now I can go to my extract. Perfect. Got the piece that I want. Say accept. Click here. Now the nice thing is I could still undo because it's a separate mesh. Undo. There we go. So now all these things are still there. There we go. This piece. Now I can do those same kind of operations that I did before. Move all this around where I want it to. Have it take on the shape that I want it to. Be real cool or inflated or create whatever I want. If I wanted this shape to be a bit cleaner in a really, really dramatic kind of way, then let me see here. Gave myself a little bit of something more difficult to work with. So it's fine. What I'll basically do here is I've got this inside edge, but I've got multiple subtools up here, or multiple polygroups. The reason I got that is because the other piece, right here, come on, has multiple polygroups. Those, when you Dynamesh, still end up staying. So you maintain those, and then I extracted them out. Whoa, what do? It's actually pretty easy, just requires a few steps. So in here, for example, I could just Control-Shift-Click to show this one. Cool. But then click it again and get rid of these various pieces just to only show this section by itself. And if I wanted to, I could Split Hidden. Split Hidden will put anything that I wasn't seeing into its own group, and I could delete this one, which is the interior stuff, and just change this polygroup, into a singular one. So I could just say, polygroups, group visible. That'll take all of these pieces and turn them into one. Much more manageable, and it means that I can start to move this around the way that I want and create specifically the shape that I'm trying to talk about making. So what I want to make is a shoulder pad that's like hard surface model looking, where things are nice and clean. Now, if this feels grossly self-promotion-y, but I'm not trying to be. I do a lot of tutorials on Pluralsight, which used to be Digital Tutors, if you're aware of that site. But basically, if you have a subscription to their stuff, I've got a crap ton of tutorials on there. A lot of them about ZBrush, and one recently about doing like hard surface modeling in ZBrush, which is actually totally manageable and pretty fun, but is its own workflow. Yeah. Plural site, like multiple, like a plural of something, with eyeballs, site. Yeah, it's all one word. I actually do not know how much it costs per month to have one of those subscriptions, but it's there. Also, if maybe we can edit this out, I don't know. I also have the source file, so I mean, maybe you just message me or something, depending on what I still have kicking around. Edit it out. I didn't say that. I won't do that. I will not do that. There is no camera. So yeah, just let me know. But just like don't obviously don't share that stuff. Like that would be mean. I'll give it to you. Please don't give it to anybody else. So in here, for example, I could take this piece and this section in here. What I can do is use a very, very cool tool, which is my ZRemesh. Geometry, ZRemesher. What ZRemesher is going to do here is actually do some really, really beneficial stuff. It's going to clean up potentially junky geometry. So in here, I could just press ZRemesher, but it's always going to go to a target polygon count. Now what that polygon count should be, you can actually just press same or half, and basically it's going to set whatever your current polygon count is and set that into that setting. You can turn it off and then go, actually I want to go a little bit higher or half, and you know what, I want to go a little bit lower than that. That's how you can kind of find out what your polygon count is through here. So I can say same and just say ZRemesh. Ta-da. Now in this case, it's still using the symmetry on the wrong axis, so it's still creating some shapes I don't want, but let's make sure that that's going the right direction. Because I feel like the example gets lost a little bit. Now, here's the thing. Here's a fun one. I think I might have had 2 axes turned on at once with ZRemesher, which will crash Photoshop 100% of the time. You can only have 1 axis turned on for symmetry when you're using ZRemesher. Otherwise, it will crash it, as it does every single time with me. Here's one of those examples. But basically, ZBrush. Like that's totally not, that's absolutely not how I want to end this. But it's going to take a second to load up. Let's just see here real quick. Generation, polygroups, color. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions that you want to know about, or any techniques that you're wondering about, things you've heard of? Yeah. That is what the other one. That's the one I was just telling you about. That is there. You can find my site and you could email me. Yeah. But again, don't share that shit. Because that's mean. There we go. I'll just load this one back up. Oh wait, I've still got that guy kicking around. I'm gonna do this guy. Boop. So this was a guy I was just messing around with previously. There's other files in here. There we go. So this guy, if I wanted to add a shoulder piece to him, it's pretty easy, especially because he's on the actual z-axis the way I wanted him to be. So again, apparently I like sculpting monsters. So there we go. So in here, I can go subtool, I can go extract, and I start to get a shape there. Pretty good. It's going to be way more detail than I need, but again, it's revisable. So I can say accept, perfectly fine, alt-click, it's going to switch into this piece. Deselect any of the masking. Now there's one feature I haven't been covering, which is solo mode. It is hard to see in here. I think it's in the draw area. Boom. Where are we here? I just want to make sure it is in here. Yeah, solo. So basically, if you're in the, it's in transform. See, this is why this stuff doesn't make sense, and you just got to get used to it. In transform, there is things like the, draw poly frame, but there's also solo mode. Solo mode is basically just going to isolate into the single subtool that you're using, which is really nice and fast. I actually have this set to the colon key, which will immediately kind of drop me in and out really fast. I use this a lot because it's super useful. So in here, I'm just going to Control-Shift-Click to kind of get rid of that other junk because I don't need it. I don't actually need the thickness. It just kind of gets made and I don't want to change it. It's fine. So now, with that gone, I'm going to go in here and delete hidden. Inside geometry, under modify topology, delete hidden. Boom. Now, in here, I can kind of smooth this out, but the geometry is a little bit too dense, so it's actually hard to do. It takes a while. How do we fix that? Well, ZRemesher. So I could say same, but it's way too high. Let's go much lower. Do it. Don't. Thank you. Yes. So now, it's going to go. And you can see here that I've got a lot less geometry. It's actually taking on the form pretty good with the ZRemesh, but I actually want to go much lower than that even. I want this like very, very simple shape. Boom, perfect. Smooth this out a bunch because I just want like this shoulder pad shape. If I wanted to get rid of any other parts, I could just kind of hide them. That's pretty good. Start pulling out the actual dimensionality that I want for this thing. Let's just pull this out. Smooth that out. Pull this out a little bit more too. Perfect. So now that that stuff's kind of pulled out, it still looks really, really junky, right? Let's go half again on that ZRemesh. Boom. And we basically just start removing more and more geometry. Oh, that section here, I can just remove it again. Basically what I want to do is delete hidden on any of that geometry there, because I don't need it. So in here, under my modify topology, delete hidden, and then let's just ZRemesh half again. The reason I keep kind of going half and half and half and lower and lower and lower is because the shape will get simpler and simpler. Also, if I turn off adapt, the shape will get, again, simpler further. This is basically like creating very, very low polygon geometry for myself. If I need to create a shape that's a little bit more crisp and clean, I just focus on the silhouette, because that's what ZRemesh is going to do. Kind of pull these like single polygons into the shape that I want. There we go. And already I'm getting like pretty much the kind of shape that I would want for some sort of shoulder piece. But because it's very low polygon, it's very easy to manage. And I don't have to do like sculpting. I'm kind of just moving geometry around. ZRemesh again. It's usually pretty quick at this point. And there we go. Geometry is a bit of a mess, but it's fine. At this point, I can kind of smooth it out, view the rest of my model, and get some pretty clean shapes for a shoulder piece. Something like this, I could start to edit and move around. With a little bit more focus, I could easily start to pull the geometry of this section up a lot. Again, if I just kind of raise up the vertices of these single points. Where are we here? Holy frame, there we go. Sometimes you just kind of need to pull these pieces in and you can see what you're working with. There we go. So now I've got that piece. And what I want to do is just use my, where are we here? Edge loops, panel loops, thickness. Let's reduce the polish on this. Let's go a little bit more thick. There we go. And when I divide this, I can start to get something that's pretty clean right away. Lastly, because this will automatically create polygroups for me, every time this extrudes out, it's always going to create polygroups. My deformation gives me the ability to polish by groups. Meaning it's going to create a really nice, crisp, clean edge for me, and these interior pieces in this case, because there's a whole bunch of extra polygroups in there. And I start to get this really clean looking shape to work with that I can still sculpt on top of and make extra shapes out of if I wanted to. There's loads of other like Z-modeler-y type stuff in there, which is ZBrush's version of like low poly modeling, which works pretty well, but is also completely, totally bananas. But you can work with it as well. I actually really enjoy working with it, but it is, just like the rest of its interface, really, really, really confusing to work with right off the bat. For example, in here, if I wanted to extrude some polygons, or if I wanted to do a different function, I have to hold spacebar and pick an option from this list. It's really goofy. This list also, oh, by the way, changes based on whether or not I have my mouse over an edge, or whether I have it over top of a vertice, or whether I have it over top of a polygon. It's really goofy. But it does get the job done, and once you get used to it, it's also actually pretty powerful. Again, not as powerful as a traditional modeling package, but it's all within one space, which does end up being pretty useful, because you can then sculpt on top of it. But that's basically the gist of it. Does anybody else have any other questions that they want to get into, or yeah?
It's a bit of a different topic, but I was wondering if you could just give sort of a brief overview of how ZBrush fits into a typical pipeline for, retopologizing for games or other applications like that. And it's only one step in the process, right?
Yes. Well, so you can retopologize in ZBrush. I am literally not going to show it because it takes too many steps and is weird and finicky, and I despise it. If you have a traditional modeling package like Blender or 3D Studio Max or Maya, use those, or use something like TopoGun. TopoGun's really powerful. 3D Studio Max actually has a really, really good retopology package inside of itself, which I love using, so I would highly recommend it. I haven't tried Blender much enough to know what it does for that, but as far as I can tell, it's really, really good. For ZBrush, the main thing that you're doing is making a high poly model and putting all the detail in and having it look real nice. That's the main thing that you're doing. For really, really fast modeling, I also like using it. If you're willing to be sloppy. So for prototyping and stuff, again, this feels pretty self-serving, but it's the best example I can think of, which is, oh, it's under my stuff. So I'm going to go to my own channel. Woo, Dan channel. With an obnoxious name, Mach 5 game asset creation. But basically this video I did because I did the TO Jam and basically found this very, very smooth process for getting an in-game mesh all inside of ZBrush that worked really, really well. So let me just go ahead here. Carcinerator was the game that I made. So I did all of the art in this for TO Jam, including the cars, the environment, everything, tons of it in ZBrush. And I was able to do all of it super, super fast, that car model in an afternoon, but purely because I was able to generate out a low poly model with Decimation Master. Decimation Master is what I cover in this process, and I also did the unwrapping inside of ZBrush in its really goofy, finicky way that it does it. Yeah, you had a question too? It's super, super goofy. I can literally show it because it's just absurd. Basically, do I have a simpler thing I can work with? What's this? Is that oh, it's part of a foot. Okay, all right. Let's do, I'm gonna grab this guy's head. That'll be just fine. I'm gonna delete the rest. And I'll actually cover real quick too. Remember I kept coming back to delete hidden? I used delete hidden a million times, and I use lots of features a lot. I want better access to them because opening up all these menus is the worst. So how do I get quick access to this? Well, what I can do is go into preferences, go into customize, config, and turn on enable customize. Now again, I've made it a shortcut for this. F12 means I can immediately start customizing. So pressing enable customize means, remember Control Alt for making hotkeys? Well, Control Alt now allows me to take any button that I have in my interface and put it somewhere else while still keeping it where it is. So for example here, modify topology, good old delete hidden, Control Alt, drag. I'm gonna put that right there. It is always now available to me whenever I need it. And if I wanted to grab anything else here like mirror and weld, I can grab that, put that there. I could even, you know what? I don't need draw size over here and focal shift over here or any of these things because I grab them elsewhere. I'm going to put other stuff here, such as delete by symmetry. Boom. I can put any of those features wherever I want, press F12 in this case, because that's the shortcut key I set up, just to pop out of that. So if there's any buttons that I kind of keep coming back to, such as, for example, my polygroups, F12, I can go to auto groups and grab that. I can go to group visible, which I use a lot, grab that, pull those in. Things like the only deformations that I actually use, I can grab those, such as polish, such as size, and I'll pull those off to the side wherever I want them to go. You can even make specific menus for yourself that you can open up on the fly. My actual interface is normally set up like this, where when I press, when I press Control Q, or Shift Q rather, I get this window, which is a custom setup of all the various buttons and things that I use that I can get whenever I want. So I could mirror things, or I could polish things right away without having to go over to anything in this menu. To get that is a few more steps. You can look that up online. It doesn't take long. Custom UI ZBrush menu, and you'll get that. All you need to do is basically make a control key for any of these. So if you Control Shift or Control Alt click, I can make a control key for this. If I press, let's say, P, now when I press P, the Preferences menu opens up right wherever my mouse is, which is really, really handy when you want to get some stuff going really quick. But back to how we unwrap this. It's pretty easy in this case. So, for example, if you wanted a good unwrap, then you're a bit out of luck right off the bat. Because it's not going to make like a good one. Like, don't expect it to make one. But basically what you can do is there's UV Master, and you can say unwrap, and then it'll go over the mesh and try to flatten it out. Now, the thing is it can tend to be pretty dumb or crash. Ooh, I don't think I deleted the rest of the geometry on that mesh. So it's either going to take a while or it crashed because this computer's not fast enough. But basically what you can do then in that situation is it'll create an unwrap. It'll flatten that thing out. What I do in that video, the Mach 5 modeling, is I separate each section of the model into different polygroups. And one of the options here that you can see right there is polygroups. So what'll happen is it'll break your unwrap up based on polygroups, which means that it'll actually kind of flatten things out. It's very good at flattening things, very, very good at it. It's just hard, it just doesn't do a good job at picking what to flatten. So you can kind of break apart where you think things should be broken apart. It'll actually do a pretty good job at it. If you flatten it, because it'll be in the video, so at least you can think about it later. There is a button here, I guess it'll show up, called Flatten. That Flatten button, will flatten your model onto like what'll look like the UVs. So it'll flatten it out so you'll see it in like the shape that you need. You can actually individually move those pieces around or reorient them to actually technically repack your unwrap. But again, like you can do it. It technically works, but it's, really finicky. I prefer to automate it and like not touch that, repack it in Blender. Again, the mesh that you get out of the process I'm talking about is not a good mesh. It's it functions. Have you been doing it? Yes. You had that like guilty face of like, no. Here's the thing. It's the best for the sake of speed, and you can clean it up. But just to tell you from experience, what can happen is if like what this process is called decimation. It's going to take your model and reduce the polygon count dramatically while still maintaining the silhouette and shape of your model incredibly well. It's a very, very good like tool that it does. Problem is it makes like unusable geometry. Like if you click an edge and you try to say loop in a traditional modeling package, you're not gonna get a loop ever. Which means that if you try to optimize the model later, if you're making a game and you start hitting the edges of performance at some point, optimizing your game later will not be fun. Will be really tricky. So you use it sparingly, especially for, yeah, I did it. Yes, this is the best day. I'm gonna say flatten and now it's gonna crash. Yeah, there we go. Give it a few more days, and then it'll flatten, and then you'll see what I'm talking about, but you won't, because it'll just look like a big splayed out weird thing. But it's pretty good. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll help you. I'll talk to you guys individually. Cool. Okay, I hope that was helpful. I hope that was useful for you guys. Again, if there's any specific parts that you want to ask me about, my name is Dan John Cox. If you search that, that's how I show up. That's the brand that I use. But it makes it easier for you to find me because there's a lot of Dan Coxes. Even in the entertainment field, there's actually another Dan J. Cox. So I have a common name. But yeah, cool. Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah.